Hello Harja, agus fáilte ag an chiad a gran eile seo de Blúiríní Béaloidis lom héin Claire Newhan agus mo chumradí Jonny Dillon. Hello Jonny.
Ahoy.
Ahoy to you too. Agus midjig tarint iste ar le féle Patrick in sig jeú na seaartne, hílmid go muid tra hehil súla haithú ar an Shanahas agus ar an scéalíart a bhain le patron mór na héan. Pilgrimages, prayers, penance, tormented medieval knights, converted pagans, banished reptiles. And you thought St. Patrick was all about snakes and shamrocks, beers and bank holidays, letting loose at Lent. I think I get a bit obsessed with alliteration. You're going to have to rein me in. I think it's one of my weaknesses.
No such thing, Claire. Fire away.
With our national patron's annual feast day fast approaching, Jonny and I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to take a critical look at this larger-than-life figure, Ireland's adopted son, half man, half myth. What do we really know about Patrick? Who was he? How did his story unfold? How was he remembered in folk tradition? What remains of his legacy today? As always, our exploration of archive materials has led us in surprising and unexpected directions. And I don't know about you, Jonny, but what struck me most with this topic, more than any other really that we've done, was how much of Patrick's lore I absorbed uncritically as a child, being, I suppose, so immersed in these traditions. I know. I just accepted everything at face value. Yes, Granny, you know, Granny. There's so much that I never actually engaged with in a critical sense, but I suppose that's natural as a child. And yet, in the last month, I've really had my eyes open to how this one body of tradition and lore acts as something of a microcosm, I suppose, and a prism through which we can see how Irish tradition grows and develops, mutates, absorbs and conflates, how the oral folk tradition affects the literary tradition and vice versa, both weaving and threading their way through the centuries. And I've really seen that in this one, I have to say, but we'll delve into that further when we look at what happens when the lore of the saintly Patrick collides with that of Finn McCool, or when he interacts with Dante, which will be a surprising one. When we rid ourselves of silly snakes and the more, I suppose, modern, kind of facetious elements of the lore.
Indeed,
and
out they go.
Out they go. And instead we'll engage with the far more ancient All-Faithtina and the more, I suppose, traditional lore that grew up kind of surrounding this figure. So when we dig down into what these beliefs and stories are really telling us, not just about this man, but about how living tradition develops through time, its causes and effects. And by the end of the hour then, hopefully we'll be in a position to drown the shamrock on Saturday in the full knowledge of why we're actually doing it. But before we jump in, we wanted to add a special note to this podcast in a way.
Yeah, to this particular one, because I suppose there's an element of sadness around the collection these last couple of days, in that a close friend of ours at the collections here, a colleague, passed away there on the morning of the 8th of March. Finbar Boyle, who was another renowned Irish man, apart from St. Patrick.
That's lovely, yeah.
Who was an expert in traditional song, an expert in song and singing, a hilarious wit and character as well. But yeah, we wanted to dedicate this podcast to him, to his memory, and at the end as well, for any listeners what should hang on, we have a fantastic song, a recording of Finbar singing in 1984, a song that he wrote himself, The Raid on Oni's Bar, which is just hilarious, and it also gives a good sense of the man himself.
Lovely.
But yeah, I was very glad to meet him. Saw him last in November or December when there was an event for the late great Tom Munley, the last full-time song, the collector who's working here for the collection, down in County Clare, collected huge amounts of ballads and folk songs and so on. And there was a 10-year anniversary for an event for Tom, and Finbar was the MC at it. And he was brilliant, but we had some pints and so on afterwards. It was great chatting to him. But when I went to introduce myself to him, and having met him before, he cut me off because he was like, "Oh, the podcast." He'd been listening to the podcast.
Ah, lovely.
He was delighted. So I was floored. I couldn't believe I was happy out. We had a great chat. But yeah. Anyway, hopefully
it's nice how we remember. I think it's one of those great traits of the collection that it is such a small team, and over the years it's a very personal collection.
Yesterday I was looking, because we scanned an image and put it on the Facebook page and made an announcement about it, and I was looking at the photographs down in the archive of some of the crew, and you had I think there was some event in Dublin, the Deer Park, at a bar, a retirement event. I think it was for Finbar or Leo Corduff or something like that, and you had all the heads there. Kevin Danaher, there was Sean O'Sullivan as well, and then the likes here, Barbara and all of them, and Rena, and all of the kind of the heads that we'd know from here, whatever. But it's amazing just to see that that thread, those different generations, but then also just how lucky are the people we meet here
I
as
know,
well.
yeah, they're a
It's
special
amazing.
bunch.
They really-
I don't
yeah,
know how we
incredible.
were let in.
Well, I don't think they know we're here.
As long as they don't discover us, we'll be all right.
Yeah, we're still broadcasting from the cupboard here. Yeah, but so anyway, we'll dedicate this to Finbarr's memory. Yeah,
Yeah, may he rest in peace.
Indeed. But yes, shall we hammer along to the good saint?
We will indeed. Shall we pop in and deal with the more historical overview of what we think we know about Patrick first of all?
Yes, that'd be worth taking a look at. Yeah, I mean. Also, I think I should first also mention to listeners to try and get some sort of picture. This happens every week where on your side of the table, it's the most immaculate and neat, fantastic to view
What you mean
array of
OCD-esque
details and notes. And then I have a heap of papers, books I can't remember what I brought, and notes and things that I can't read.
Yes, but it's all in your head, Jonny. That's the terrifying thing.
It's I don't know if it's the historical Patrick, I suppose. Well, it's hard to kind of this part of it, kind of like you were mentioning earlier, say the difference between the interplay between the literary and then the folkloric traditions and the myth and the historic figure. The Patrick's mission is typically kind of viewed in Ireland or associated with the dates of the year 432 to 461. That was the date of his mission. Mm. And we have a couple of sources in the early literature. We have two sources from him, his Confessio.
That's right.
And his letter to Caroticus, which is a letter to a chieftain who stole away some of Patrick's converts. And so he's greatly displeased with this. But then apart from, so that's the kind of material by Patrick's hand himself. And then apart from that, we have later kind of lives of the saints. One of which was written by Dillon, who's the monk in Sligo, and another which was written by Murchu. And these two seem to draw on an earlier work which is now disappeared and gone by an Ultan, who was an abbot at the monastery that St. Patrick apparently founded in Louth. And so this was kind of thought to have been written in the early 7th century, and then these later lives of St. Patrick by Doohan and by Murchu were written kind of in centuries after that, basically. So there's material featuring St. Patrick and a lot of the lore regarding him and his kind of his battling with pagan chieftains and his miracle working and so on and so forth there. And
should we just say, because I always think this is crucial, that you always need to be looking at who's writing about him, because they all have their own agendas, these later chroniclers. So you've got the likes of Doohan, who is claiming Patrick for Connacht. You've got Murchu, who's claiming him for Ulster. And then later ones, for example, Patrick, who is claiming him for Munster and all his kind of activities and itineraries in those areas.
Yeah.
And thus it makes him very much a national saint then.
Yeah, that's what makes him the national figure, as opposed to one saint localised with a certain locality, as in just in Mayo or just in Munster or just Munster. But he becomes this national saint, and they invent in these lives of his, these tours he does, imaginary tours of Munster or whatever. And we'll look later on then at some of the instances or that local parishes would often slag one another by saying he never visited your area and so on and so forth. True. But you have those lives of his by Murchu and Doohan, as you mentioned, with their own kind of biases or inclinations, whatever, and his Confessio and his letter to Caroticus. And then you also have the Colloquy of the Elders, which is an amazing and interesting kind of text which falls under the corpus really of the Fenian cycle, which kind of the lore and narratives that relate to Fionn McCool and the Fianna, that kind of the poet, seer, warrior figure, pre-Christian kind of pagan warrior hero who leads a band of warriors around the country, basically, as they go hunting and banishing monsters from lakes and stuff like this, and composing poems and having a general time of it, whatever. And in the Colloquy to the Elders, it's a 12th century text, but it's found in the Book of Lismore, which is a 15th century text. I never know how they're able to date the language so specifically. It's amazing to me, really, where they can say, oh, this is clearly a kind of 12th century text.
It's clearly a discipline. We're not claiming any specialism in this at all.
Zero.
Absolutely
no idea.
Zero.
But this is the what you'd often find, say, in later manuscripts. Maybe there's a manuscript from the 15th century, but within it there might be a text which has been copied, and the language is obviously that of the 12th or the 8th century or something, so it can be kind of dated in that way. But the Colloquy of the Elders is where St. Patrick meets Oisin and Kiltu, these kind of the last of the Fianna, these giants, kind of the pre-Christian figures. and it's quite a kind of light-hearted and jovial text, really. And Patrick is kind of inquiring of the master lives, what did they do and what was their life like, basically. So those are the texts, but that they blend the kind of this mixture of kind of myth and then the historic or whatever. But as for Patrick himself, he was born into a kind of a pretty well-off Romanized kind of, I guess, was Romanized Celtic family in somewhere in Western Britain.
It's very hard to locate it, because I know from the bits that I was reading, it was essentially all we actually know about Patrick of what he tells us himself are in those two documents you mentioned,
That's it, yeah.
the Confessio and the Letter to Croagh. And so Owen MacNeill, who was the great Irish historian of the 20th century, wrote quite a bit about the patrician legend. And he was trying to locate his native place, so he did a lot of detailed analysis of raiding patrons, which we were speaking about at the time. It was fascinating in how the Irish pillaged
left, right and centre.
Left, right and centre along Western, the British, or what was then Britain, for slaves for their own masses.
Yeah, Dublin was a huge city for centre of slave trade back kind of in the day, as it were. Yeah.
So once the oppressor as opposed to the oppressed.
Absolutely, yeah. It's important to bear that in mind as well, because if you go back to this, there were these raiding parties, there were tributes being exacted from towns in Britain and so on. You had tribes in Britain asking or looking for the help of kind of Roman legions and so on to protect them from these raiding kind of hordes and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's an interesting and kind of complex narrative that often I suppose it kind of slightly undercuts maybe some of the other versions that you'd know. But Patrick was stolen as a slave by the Irish from Britain.
Or so we're told.
When he was 16, partly, yeah. And from relative wealth and kind of material comfort, really, he found himself suddenly in a strange land, tending to kind of these flocks and so on as a slave, sleeping out under the kind of, open canopy of the stars and kind of wandering around in hardship, basically. A fact which I suppose had a huge impact on the young Patrick for those years that he was in captivity. Owen MacNeill as well, there's a book of his, Celtic Ireland, and he apparently there's some suggestion from the word that was used, I think it was fuchel, for the wood that Patrick apparently spent time in, and certain scholars have interpreted this as a huge kind of tract of land in Mayo that he was in captivity. But Owen MacNeill disputes that fact basically by saying that the word itself, fuchel, means little forest, minor forest kind of thing, so that it can't necessarily be derived that where the geographical area was of Mayo necessarily, but that's the common assumption in many times that this is where he spent at least a portion of his captivity, basically, from when he was 16 years old. I have there's a little piece here from a book, Early Irish Saints by John J. O'Riordan. It's a nice little book, and it describes Patrick in some of his 6 years of slavery. But it says here, at 16, Patrick had grown up on account of the situation in which he found himself. Boredom had vanished. There was determination and direction in his life, and God was at the heart of it. And many years later, in his confession, this is the document that we made mention of earlier on, he wrote, "My faith grew stronger and my zeal so intense that in the course of a single day I would say as many as 100 prayers and almost as many in the night. This I did even when I was in the woods and on the mountains. Even in times of snow or frost or rain, I would rise before dawn to pray. I never felt the worse for it, nor was I in any way lazy, because, as I now realise, I was full of enthusiasm." So he's describing his part of his kind of 6 years in slavery on the mountain, whatever, and this is what kind of, I suppose, sharpened his mind towards consideration of unseen reality and prayer and so on and so forth. But then he managed to escape. And the common kind of, I suppose what we understand is that he had to travel hundreds of kilometres, managed to get a boat to the continent with great difficulty, wound up in captivity somewhere else for another couple of months, and then eventually got back to Britain to his family. But while he was in the continent, he received in a dream or a vision somebody bringing him letters, all containing the voices of the Irish. And he had a dream asking where the Irish came, and they asked him that he would walk once more among them, basically. So he decided, right, I'm going to have to go back to that place where I was a slave, having a terrible time. And he did. And then in his confession, in that the document, he kind of calmly states how he baptized thousands and kind of chieftains and kings and so on and so forth. So I suppose the interesting thing, I guess, is how this figure then becomes a national kind of patron and patron saint of the country, as he has.
But it might just be, could I pop in there, was one of the things I found really interesting about this topic was the idea of two Patricks. Now, for historians who would have studied this, they'll be like, well, yes, we've been over this. But just
I don't know.
Well,
yeah, you were saying this, I don't know about this.
Yeah,
this
for those who
workshop.
aren't familiar, it might just be, I'll flag it up and then you can certainly go and dig a little deeper. But tying in with what Owen McNeill was saying, who was kind of thought of as a well-known patrician scholar. But then in 1942, along comes Thomas Francis O'Rahilly, or T.F. O'Rahilly.
Oh, yes.
Who we often hear about when studying Irish history, and caused a bit of a hoo-ha when he published a paper which became a book called The Two Patricks. And basically, he posited the theory that there were two men. So one called Palladius, who was said to have arrived a year before Patrick in Ireland, 431 AD, and that the lore and the legend of one has become conflated with the other, thus creating the Patrick, in inverted commas, that we know today. So Palladius, from what we see, there is a historical record, we're told, that, now it's written in Latin, I won't even attempt, because I'll only embarrass myself, but roughly it translates to, it's the religious order, I suppose, that he's given, Palladius, to travel to Ireland. So it says, from Pope Celestine I, that he sends Palladius to the Irish, believing in Christ. Pope Celestine sends Palladius as the first bishop, and that's 431 AD, which, number one, that makes you think, right, so it wasn't Patrick who first came to Christianise the Irish, and number two, the fact that it says to the Irish believing in Christ, it means that we are to assume that there were those who already believed before any of these came. So again, we are not experts in this.
Lies.
But, lies. But I just thought it was so curious to raise the fact, when looking at St. Patrick, to remember Palladius as this figure who may or may not have had aspects of his life conflated with Patrick's. And then even as we travel to Scotland as well, Palladius pops up in that he is associated with the northeast in areas around is it Fordoun and Auchenblay, that they have churches, and that they used to have what was called a Poldy Fair or a Poldy Well, which people associate with Palladius as well. Very
Amazing.
interesting. So
Spare a thought.
spare thought for Palladius, who was the
Forerunner.
indeed, I was going to give some metaphor about a band and a lead singer and somebody on the drums, but anyway, well, I don't know how that was going to work.
We'll skip over that.
It was
We'll
going to
pass
make
over that in
sense.
silence.
But yeah, so the two Patricks, when thinking of Patrick, don't forget Palladius.
Yes, actually, as you mentioned as well, that's really interesting that there's wells to him up in Scotland, because if you think about there was the kind of the flourishing of monasticism that occurred in Ireland, and that gave Irish Christianity its particular flavour. That, like, I think, it kind of manifested from the 6th century on, maybe, as opposed to other kind of parochial structures, maybe, or ways of organising. The ways that the church organised itself, the bishops and so on, that the abbey and the abbot were the main kind of features of Christian tradition in Ireland, in early Ireland. But there was a kind of arc then that moved all the way from Ireland up into Scotland, and then down again even into the northern kind of regions of Britain and England and so on, that there's that kind of interplay of monasticism and so on spreading across. But that Palladius is a strange
It's curious.
figure.
It caused a lot of
They fell out about it.
they did, and it was in the papers, because I saw it in the scrapbooks, and you had
Amazing.
the likes of Flann O'Brien commenting on it, and Brian O'Nolan. You had James Plunkett writing about it and saying, "Are we to believe that there are two Patricks, or there's no Patrick at all? Is there a God?" So it was a real.
Who was that having that crisis? Who was
That was James Plunkett.
Amazing, right?
So it really did in the 40s cause in
stir.
academic circles, certainly among the folk, they were probably fine with Patrick as he was. But it's
I
interesting.
think
to note.
the symbolism kind of becomes absorbed, and it doesn't really it becomes a symbol of something that's broader than the historic individual. So it's a different sort of truth, really, to which people are kind of are devoting themselves or praying and so on. But yeah, the kind of early historic figure it's very difficult to prize apart the kind of the mythic and the folkloric and the historical and so on. But I suppose should we go to talk about maybe the aspect of kind of pilgrimage and so on?
That was going to be the next, because we kind of been looking at the history and then
some
the
of the
arrival.
literary sources that a person can kind of go to, basically. Yeah.
It's true, and then kind of the arrival of Christianity and what Christianity in those terms in Patrick's time meant and the birth of the pilgrimage.
The main, I suppose, the most renowned really pilgrimage that has existed from the Middle Ages and still is in kind of, I suppose, a state of rude health today is that of the Reek Sunday, Croagh Patrick, and Reek from Rick, as in a kind of a bundle or of something, whatever. Croagh Patrick is Croagh Patrick, the holy mountain in County Mayo, and on the last Sunday in July, on Garland Sunday, tens upon tens of thousands of pilgrims ascend, some of them barefoot, on this really steep and rocky and kind of hard mountain to climb. Especially people doing it on their knees and so on, and kind of so it was a renowned kind of site of pilgrimage. But there's also an enormous amount of archaeological evidence that would suggest that the site of Croagh Patrick has been a holy mountain since at least the Neolithic or Bronze Age or Neolithic period, really, because all around this mountain, which is situated in the northwestern kind of quarter of Ireland by Clew Bay and County Mayo, in a beautiful part of the country, all around this mountain, which stands in kind of stark opposition to the land all around it, there are kind of cairns, burial mounds, tombs, rock art, and so on, all around the base of this mountain, basically, which would suggest it as a holy site, or kind of a sort of supernatural or ritual landscape, for want of a better word, of one sort or another, whereby in certain instances maybe you stand at a burial mound and you can observe the mountain X amount of miles away from you. But it was noticed relatively recently that I think on the 18th of April and perhaps the 24th of August, maybe, 18th of April, a date at the end of August, when you stand at a certain rock that has rock art on it, looking at Croagh Patrick at the mountain, the sun rolls down the shoulder of it. It looks as though it's rolling along.
Oh, as the sun sets.
As the sun sets,
Oh,
yeah.
I see.
So you have a kind of I suppose archaeological remains and ruins and sites in the landscape that are aligned to this mountain, which I suppose would seem to have this kind of ritual or symbolic significance. But it's also interesting when you take the date of the 18th of April and the other date, I'm not exactly sure, but the 24th of August, I think. And then if you incorporate into that the winter solstice, you have a neat triplication or division of the year into three as well. So there are all these kind of sites around Croagh Patrick that would suggest it as a sacred landscape prior to the arrival of Christianity. And it's not the only one. The Sugarloaf is the mountain under which I grew up very close in County Wicklow in the eastern quarter of Ireland. That's the same. It has these similar kind of sites all around it, but it doesn't seem to have made the jump into Christian tradition of pilgrimage and these kind of sites, whatever. But enormous amounts of pilgrims ascend to that mountain. A chapel was built on the top of it, and St. Patrick was said to have experienced his kind of 40 nights of horror on that mountain, basically. As
During Lent, wasn't it?
During Lent, yeah. He made his Lenten observance there. So Moses kind of communing with God on Mount Sinai or Christ in the desert and so on. St. Patrick, it fits into that same kind of framework, basically. But again, it's overlaid over this pre-Christian tradition. So the holy mountain that's ascended today in the name of Christ is one that would have been ascended in the name of other deities. For example, Lough and Crumdove did battle on that mountain at harvest time as well. So,
and we'll actually come to Crumdove shortly because he is one of the pagans, but so-called or said to be converted by Patrick, and Garland Sunday is known as Ona Crumdove. Which is, but apparently I read somewhere that true Mayo locals would say that they climb it on the Friday before Garland Sunday, but traditionally anything I've read, it's always been Garland Sunday.
I think Garland Sunday was kind of marked the arrival of the period of harvest. So it was the end of kind of hungry July and so on, where the first stores were beginning to come in again after, the summer was a period of hardship for many people across the country. So at that time, because the crops in the stores are at the lowest, Garland Sunday was often known as Hill Sunday, Height Sunday, Bilberry Sunday, Frothenberry Sunday, Rock Sunday, Big Sunday, Mountain Sunday. Those are just some English language words for it. And the general tradition at that time was for groups, particularly of young men and women, to sport and play at the tops of these mountains, often without the kind of the I suppose the eye of parents and grandparents and so on them, so they could kind of go off and have a crack themselves, basically. So there were often kind of contests and feats of athletics and strength and so on, but it was generally the last Sunday. But there's a bit of interplay or kind of back and forth of that sort of stuff all the time.
But Crumdove is in his image we begin to see a lot of the common motifs that we see with Patrick. in the conversion of pagans, in the kind of expelling of demons and so on. But I just love the story of Crumdoo, one of those that exists in the archive. It just shows the imagination of the storytellers and kind of the stories that grew up around it, because it's basically, as a little synopsis, Crumdoo gives a piece of meat to Patrick, sends it with a boy to give him, and Patrick writes it down, Deo Gratias.
Yeah, he just says Deo Gratias.
Oh, I see. Okay.
He just
as thanks for the meat. Now, I read those papers, but again, it varies across the tradition, but it works both ways. And so the boy comes back and Crumdoo says, "What did he say? Did he give thanks?" And he says, "I didn't understand a word that man said." Says, "Well, here, take another quarter." And he went and gave it to Patrick. And again, Patrick writes down Deo Gratias and brings it back. And the boy says, like the Crumdoo asks, "What did he say? Did he give thanks?" And he says, I don't understand what he said. So he says, "Right, here, take the next quarter." So eventually he basically gives him a full bullock of meat, so to speak, in the 4 quarters. And each time Patrick says thank you, but the boy doesn't understand, comes back, infuriates Crumdoo, until eventually he says, "This is ridiculous, not good enough." And Patrick is brought to him and says, "But I did thank you in great terms. I was so grateful." And he says, "I don't believe you." And they have a bit of a ruckus. And so eventually Patrick writes down, or maybe this is when he writes it down, the Deo Gratias 3 times or 4 times. So he's got 3 or 4 pieces of paper, and he puts it on a scale, and he puts the meat on the other side. And lo and behold, the weight of the thanks is bigger than the weight of the meat. Yeah. And Crumb is converted
there and then.
In a moment of epiphany. Yeah. But it's just the imagination that goes into this.
Incredible, yeah. And it's really interesting, actually, because I was trying to remember earlier, but you reminded me of it now. The Deo Gratias that's mentioned there, where Crumb gives the bullock and he feels as though he's being hard done by because he doesn't understand the nature of the thanks that's been given. There's an earlier reference to that to a pagan chieftain, Doohan, and he gives him a bronze cauldron, and the bronze cauldron is given to him, and he says, "Grazacham" is all that's written, and the guy's like, what the hell? So he comes back and Dora says, "What did he say? Did he praise me and give me thanks?" And he said, "He just said Grazacham." And they're like, "What the?" So then he takes the pot back. I think Dora eventually himself gives it to him, and he says Grazacham again, and it's the same kind of this confusion and misunderstanding over the thanks that's been given. We actually find reference to Patrick actually writing that in his Confessio as a phrase that he actually used, gratis agam, as in I am thankful. Agam is the Irish word for it's, me or I have or whatever. Then gratis is from the Latin, I suppose. So it's a phrase of his that's actually written in the confession, and that Doohan then seems to become associated or become kind of absorbed in the popular tradition into that figure of Crum, who represents this kind of older Crum Dove, dark stooping one, as his name.
That'll be us in a few years.
So yeah, it's an amazing kind of, and there's lots of those types of kind of motifs that are so kind of humorous in ways where there's a misunderstanding between maybe a pagan chieftain who greatly underestimates the power of this new god or this new kind of system, and so it eventually then kind of comes around to realize, oh, actually this is much more powerful than I've understood or whatever.
And it's all symbolism, isn't it? When you dig down into it.
It's true.
And we wanted to say something, didn't you, about the birds?
I suppose in the lives, I think in the lives of Saint Patrick, I don't know, is it Tirachans or Murchus? In the first of them, when Patrick is on the mountain for his 40 days and 40 nights and so on, he's accosted by these black birds and demons and so on, who are just kind of giving a terrible time, till eventually he casts this huge bell at them, or rings it so loudly or something like that they all flee. And I think that from that point they leave Ireland for 7 years, 7 months, 7 days and 7 nights. They never come back again at that time. But I suppose afterwards then Patrick has an angel that's associated with him, Victor, who generally speaks to him from a bush or a burning bush. Again, these kind of biblical kind of motifs that the writers kind of
were using, because that's again a source they were taking from.
Well, as well, the thing you have to remember as well is like when the written word comes into Ireland, or the manifestation of the written word in Britain and elsewhere in Europe, whatever, it is a Christian kind of technology, basically. Like you have, say, the kind of ogham writing and so on, and maybe poems and obituaries and so on that feature. or other kind of inscriptions, whatever. But they never recounted the knowledge, and the epic kind of bardic tradition was held by the Druidic order, this esoteric kind of order, who had a taboo against writing these things down. And so in that sense, figures like Oisin and Fionn and so on, they live forever in a sense of in the narratives, because they're being spoken all the time. Whereas then in the colloquy of the elders, when Patrick meets Oisin and Cuilt and so on later on, Oisin will often turn to Patrick's scribe and say, write this down, because it's kind of, it's the spoken word is now meeting the written word, and the pre-Christian and pagan is now meeting the Christian, whatever. There's a changing system, but at this time you would have had monks and figures in these abbeys who would have been, some of whom would have been deeply familiar with the knowledge of their forebears, of the esoteric kind of wisdom of the Druids, who might have even been indoctrinated or initiated into certain aspects of those practices, whatever, before then maybe becoming monks. So you would have had extremely learned people who are fond of these traditions, recounting them, but also incorporating these other biblical motifs that they have to kind of use to, I suppose, assert the supremacy of this new system, basically.
It's a melting pot. It becomes
really,
a melting
really
pot
is. It
of
really
sources.
is. Yeah. It's bizarre, and so then you have this strange kind of landscape where the Christian and the pre-Christian just kind of wander around together in this strange Catholic paganism, basically, for want of a better term. I suppose.
That's the name of a band now. I'm obsessed with the bands today. I don't know what's wrong with me.
I'd listen to that band. Yeah. But yeah, I suppose the site of the mountain becomes, I suppose, a space where it's associated with Patrick. It's associated with his Lenten observance, with his part of his kind of penance and suffering for Ireland, or whatever. Actually, and as part of that, when he comes down from the mountain, he refuses to break his fast, and he refuses to leave the mountain until he's granted by God several boons for Ireland. One of which is that St. Patrick himself will judge the Irish at the last day, or so when we die and depart and off we go to the other world or whatever. St. Patrick will be there to judge the Irish. The other thing that he manages to get as a kind of from God, whatever, is that no foreign people shall ever rule Ireland forever. This is another kind of motif that was thrown in. And the last one is that before the destruction and end of the world, 7 years beforehand, Ireland would be submerged so that it wouldn't have to face the final obliteration.
That's quite worrying, because we're actually becoming wetter as a nation, aren't we?
We are. But
and the coasts are kind of encroaching upon us.
These things have been decreed by time, Claire.
Time is ticking then, in that case.
Argue. Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, part of Patrick's particular kind of I suppose, role as a saint, protective of the Irish and protector of Ireland, is kind of manifest after his time here at Croagh Patrick. First of all, he's arguing with God and all of the saints, and they're all saying, no, I'm sorry, Patrick, we just can't do this for you. And eventually, our Saviour's mother, that's described in the narrative, she hears, what's all this going on? And, she comes along and Patrick explains, and then she goes and talks to God and events. So God's mother eventually is the one who relents. Which is quite an Irish thing, I think.
Isn't it? The mammy.
Like the mammy has to come in and sort it out. Yeah,
sort it out for the boys. So I suppose that's a good segue now into the second great pilgrimage that's associated with Patrick, known as Lough Derg or Lough Derg in Donegal. So we're moving from Mayo in the west to Donegal in the northwest, and I'm going to read you just three little quotes first of all that really stuck with me when I was reading about Lough Derg. Again, it's one of those familiar ideas in our childhoods here in Ireland, and particularly in Donegal, of Lough Derg, where people would go to do penance and do pilgrimages, and you just almost absorb this as a natural thing for those who are interested. But the history and the lore of it is incredible as I was reading this. But just to give you three little quotes. So in 1617, we have a piece of writing that describes Lough Derg as a place horrible by its terrors. Its fame has been so scattered through European parts that it seems to go on wings. And then we have...
This is with terror about how scary the place was.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Lough Derg, not Donegal. Donegal's beautiful. Yeah. Lovely place to go. Then we have a Latin text from Vienna in 1703 that says, "In Connacht is St. Patrick's Reek, his purgatory in Ulster Seek." So as you mentioned, St. Patrick's Reek in Mayo, and then we have Lough Derg, where his purgatory is situated in Donegal. And then from 1825, then we have a statement, "A fragment fallen from ancient time, it floated there unchanged." by a man called Darcy McGee, who was a young islander. So this...
I don't quite understand the whole thing. But what is, like, how did St. Patrick's Purgatory come about? Well, he banished a demon from the lake.
Well, this is it. This is, again, what we were chatting about at the very beginning of how all these stories become quite mixed and conflated, and they're taken from historical lore, and then they get mixed in with Fenian lore that comes later.
Yeah.
But essentially, Lough Derg is this kind of a medium-sized lake in Donegal, 13 miles in in circumference, 7 miles wide. And within it, you have a number of smaller islands. So the two that we're kind of focusing on today is Saints Island and Station Island. And on Station Island, we are told that there was once a cave that you would enter into, and I will come to the history of this, but that you would be terrorized by visions.
Amazing.
You'd love that, Jonny.
Yeah.
In one end, out the other. So that you would go and spend the night in here and be terrorized by visions of purgatory, basically, and that you would hopefully see the plane of heaven and do penance and gain absolution for your
like
sins.
walking through Temple Bar on St. Patrick's Day itself.
Pretty much, if you can make it out alive, no hell for you.
Circle of hell.
So this idea of St. Patrick's Cave, otherwise known as St. Patrick's Purgatory, now originally from the 5th century onwards, this, again, as you were saying with the reek and the sugarloaf, it was a very ancient site. So it would have attracted pilgrims and a great sense of reverence before the literary aspects that we'll discuss now came along. So from the 5th century onwards, you see this as being a very sacred place in the landscape with these associations. But in 1153, the story emerges, and this is very much not based on fact. It's a story that kind of someone has created of a knight own. So it's this, where my details here.
This is the Arthurian fellow.
This is the Arthurian Fellows. So this is apparently a knight who was enlisted in the service of the Norman King of England, and he had a religious reawakening and went to this island, again having been aware of its dominance already, to seek penance and absolution for what he called his wicked life, which has been employed from the cradle in plunder and violence. Amazing. So off he goes to Donegal, which, you know, you have to really think about this in terms of the 12th century Donegal. It's rural and isolated and beautiful now, but can you imagine in the 12th century what that must have been like for someone getting there and going to this remote little island in the middle of this lake?
To sit in a cave.
Amazing. And look for epiphanies. But the idea emerged that he went here and spent 3 nights, I believe, on the island. And his tests, once he went into the cave, he saw people being dragged through fire, people being eaten by dragons, serpents, beasts, people being held over furnaces by iron hooks through their bodies while being lashed by demons, bodies being submerged in freezing waters. And then the final test, he overcomes each of these by saying something along the lines of Christ forgive me, or Christ be beside me, kind of invoking the Lord's name and kind of embracing Christianity. And he comes to the final test, which is a bridge over purgatory, or whatever. This kind of, you're imagining these furnaces and flames beneath you, but it's the bridge of 3 impossibilities, because it's too high, it's too narrow, and it's too slippy.
Oh, that's amazing.
Amazing, just honestly. See, when people didn't have TV, the imagination. So he makes it across the bridge into the plain of paradise, where he's given food and drink, and he's with the souls that are to be saved and who will gain entry into heaven. So at this time, he is allowed back through the entryway back to reality in the kind of the upper world, into Lough Derg, to say that he is to be free from sin now and that he must live a good and honest life. And so this story emerges, and a guy called Henry Saltrey, a few years later, I believe, writes the Latin account of this, because like all great stories, he knew someone who knew Owen and then wrote it down. But then what amazed me was this story spread like wildfire through Europe.
Yeah.
And it becomes, from the 12th century onwards, a site of pilgrimage for people from all over Europe.
Yeah, it's like the worst of the worst. It wasn't just kind of the relaxed Sunday barefoot asceticism or whatever. This is like, wasn't there someone who murdered his son or something like that?
Hardcore criminals,
really
apparently.
Hardened kind of.
Yeah, as well as nobles. So you see a lot of European nobles coming. But no, you're absolutely right. Apparently, it drew those for whom penance couldn't be found anywhere else.
Okay, yeah,
So you can only imagine what they did.
Yeah.
All coming to Donegal. God, I might be like, and they might be my ancestors,
Could
Jonny.
be, they could
God.
be. Shouldn't speak ill of them.
But even in one of the books I was reading, written by Sir Shane Leslie, who actually, I believe, his family held rights over Lough Derg for a certain period of time. But even just some of the names of people who came, he's got French, he's got Swiss, he's got Hungarian, he's got Italian, he's got Dutch, English.
Wow.
You name it, just thousands coming over the centuries to visit this island, to do penance.
Amazing.
And to seek absolution. And again, kind of, there's, like, and again, we love a bit of speculation, but there are theories that because this was so well known in early maps in Italy, kind of from the 13th century onwards, you see any representation of Ireland, you have St. Patrick's Purgatory. That's how well known it was across
incredible.
Europe. So for these trading routes, people knew of St. Patrick's Purgatory, and the theory, and I say theory with heavy emphasis.
We mean fact.
This is a true story. Some say were the likes of Dante, who did the
Inferno.
Divine Comedy and the Inferno, because it does seem so much like the other, doesn't it? Like just delving into the seventh circle of hell. Was he influenced by this? And some have made the points in the material that I've been reading that his master, his mentor, would have written about St. Patrick's Purgatory, and I wonder, would he have spoken to Dante about this? And therefore is Donegal responsible for
That's intriguing.
Dante's Inferno? Now, that is speculation, but isn't it just interesting? Like, if you had told me, Claire, what links Donegal and Dante a month ago,
Amazing.
I'd be like,
I love it.
Not the heat anyway.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, but just, it's so interesting.
It's incredible. It's
the more you
incredible.
look into this. But yeah, so that is St. Patrick's Purgatory.
We have to go, where we were saying what failures we are as folklorists and that we haven't been, because you can still go for a pilgrimage there. You have to go 3 days, you have to walk around, no sleep.
Or you can do one day.
You can do one day.
Yeah, if you're just easy in.
You march about in no shoes, no sleep.
You do. It's kind of broken into 3 parts of the fast, the vigil, and the station. I think you're allowed to wear shoes now, Jonny. I hope.
No shoes. I'd like to do that, I must say.
It's a real, I think it harks back to a very primitive urge in people for
Asceticism and transcendence at a basic level, I suppose.
Yeah,
through
just to
some
get
form of
away
hardship
from-
and get away. And, yeah.
You'd love that, Jonny. But one of the quotes I'll finish with, I loved from, it was one of the writers, the books that I was reading. He had spoken to a colleague of his who'd gone, and he was saying that a priest had said, it's not a tourist spa, you know. Lourdes, Fatima, even Croagh Patrick, they're all joyrides. When you go to Lough Derg, when you see the place, the heart dies on you.
Wow.
In fact, the pilgrimage is so extreme that many of us commit a sin the moment it's over, the sin of pride, that inner feeling of self-importance and superiority, that I've done something you couldn't. So, for many over centuries, it was a place of penance and utter and extreme hardship that we very much associate with St. Patrick. Now, it became very much tied in with him, that this is where he would have gone and done a fast. And
That's the thing. The specific connection to Patrick is that he banished a monster from the lake, which is a kind of a borrowing from even the Fenian cycle lore.
Yes.
They're always banishing monsters from lakes. It's what they do, among other things. But wasn't there that was kind of one of the legends told about him in later times, that he had managed to banish this kind of serpent, this demon serpent, from the lake.
Into the
Is
lake. That he
into the lake?
Yes, that this was the where the water turns red. So
Hence Lough Derg.
yeah, so some people say that Lough Derg means the red.
Yeah, but there's
lake.
an argument about the place name. Isn't
Exactly,
There's-
because some say that it's, even Owen McNeill would have said originally that it's Lough Derg of the word cave, so the loch of the cave. But there is that, as you said, this idea of, as Patrick expels monsters kind of across Ireland, and we see these stories in the archive a lot, that it's associated with Lough Derg as well, in that he kind of banishes this monster into the lake and turns the water red. But we see that with Finn McCool as well.
Yes,
very
and it's
often.
also one of the kind of, I don't know if you can say misconceptions, because it's a very commonly held, I suppose, idea that Patrick banished serpents from Ireland.
Yes, the old snakes.
The old snakes, which is actually a much later kind of, later borrowing from printed Anglo-Norman tradition. Because you have people like the writer Bede, or certain even kind of Greek writers and so on, talking about Ireland and how it was famously snakeless long before Patrick's existence. But apparently in the course of Patrick's travels, he stayed on an island off the coast of France in a monastery, off the southwestern coast of France, possibly. I forget the name of the island now. And the abbey in which he stayed was founded by a monk called Saint Honoratus. And Saint Honoratus in France, Léran, I think is the island, L-E-Flexon or I-N-S.
Oh, okay.
And Saint Honoratus had banished snakes from this island in France. This is the motif that was attached to him in his abbey. And since St. Patrick had stayed at this abbey, so we're told the Anglo-Norman or the later Norman kind of writers took this motif and borrowed it and applied it to Irish tradition, but it never really focused or featured as a principal kind of association with him in folk tradition.
True, because we never see it. I have no snakes in the archive
You
here
don't
that
really
I could
get
find.
it as, no, but you find it kind of later on, I suppose, and it becomes a very common thing that we would have known, but it's very much a printed motif that comes from later medieval Anglo-Norman writers who are borrowing from a motif of Saint Honoratus on the island of Léran in France, who himself was said to have banished snakes from that particular French island at which St. Patrick is meant to have stayed. That's where that motif seems to begin or whatever.
Because as you were saying, Johnny, the kind of the silly snakes we speak about, it's a very kind of modern literary creation, but as you rightly noted, it's a far more ancient idea and motif, the expelling of, I suppose, monsters and reptiles in Irish lore, because we've got the 7th or kind of 8th century actor Argus and Macletti, you've got the 8th century Ten Bofri, you've got the 15th century Finian Lay, Shillig Shlivachrum, and then you've got the 16th century Shillig Lough Derg. And this is again tying in with what we were saying about Finn and changing or killing monsters and banishing them into lochs and turning the water red. So it's a far more ancient idea of the Allfeistin as the reptiles as opposed to the snakes that are far more modern.
Yes, they are. And there's a nice, I can't find the reference, but to St. Patrick talking about banishing spirits and demons, but it says he just does that when he first meets Oisin and Culta. They have thousands of demons whirling about over them, which they've just picked up in the course of their lives being these kind of warriors, and they all fly off and are banished. But there's a nice piece where a kind of interplay between Patrick and he's asking about Fionn McCool, and he says to the followers of Fionn, to Oisin and Culta, who were still alive at the time, long after their age has kind of gone, these huge giant men walking along with wolfhounds and so on. And Patrick says to them, was he not a good lord with whom ye were, Fionn McCool, that is to say? And it says then, upon which Culta uttered this little tribute of praise. Were but the brown leaf which the wood sheds from it gold, were but the white billow silver, Fionn would have given it all away. Who or what was it that maintained you so in your life? Patrick inquired, and Culta answered, truth that was in our hearts, and strength in our arms, and fulfilment in our tongues. A fine little piece.
Isn't that
but Fionn's generosity is kind of mentioned that thing, and that's I suppose the tone of the colloquy is quite of the other is quite. It kind of carries on in that way. It's very kind of cheerful is maybe the wrong word. It's very. Patrick takes a fine view of these warriors, and he's interested in them, and he kind of. So the scribe is, again, the Christian monk scribe who's dictating this material is doing so from the perspective of early Irish Christianity, while also having an awareness and obviously a kind of a fondness for the tradition of his own forebears, being that of the Fenian cycle and so on. But it's very much the written word meeting the spoken word, and the fact that Owen McNeill, I think, made this nice comparison of the idea that Fionn and Culta and Oisin live so long that they're these kind of immortal figures because they live by virtue of their being spoken all the time almost. You know, they're not written and then, he lived 1,000 years ago, but they're frozen in text. They're the ever-living ones on account of their being constantly spoken into being, say, whereas this marks the kind of end of that, where Oisin will turn to the scribe, as mentioned earlier, and say, write this down, at which point it's frozen and moves into the past in a way.
Oh, he's almost signing his own...
In a way, yeah. And it's all kind of just this idea that it's all kind of past and done. But there was also, I suppose, the narrative surrounding St. Patrick, that while he was so busy preaching, he fell asleep and asked his servant, he has a servant, Benignus, who goes around with him, as a kind of an associate, whatever. But he asks this other little fellow who's with him, a young fellow, to watch him while he sleeps and listen very carefully to what he says. And he utters 3 curses on Ireland in his sleep. But the young fellow who's with him manages to kind of complete the sentence and deflects the curses. So one of them goes onto the tops of the rushes, which are always black. One of them goes onto the tops of ferns, I think, for the sun. They're kind of wilted and brown for the same reason. and one of them goes onto the tops of bull's horns.
That's right.
And they're always, so these things are always black on account of that. And then when he wakes up, then he says, "Oh, you saved Ireland." Fair play to you. But there's a little piece here to play, which describes just that. This is Tom Naughton. He was recorded by Leo Corduff in 1966, and this is St. Patrick and his three curses.
Did you ever hear anything about St. Patrick and three curses? Something about he had dreamed or something?
About St. Patrick. St. Patrick, when he was sleeping out on those hills, doing penance, he had his boy with him, servant boy, do you see?
Yes.
So he used to sleep while, and the boy had wakened, I believe.
Yes.
So anyways, he was sleeping away, and he started to dream, and he cursed 3 times in his dream. So the first time he cursed, the boy said, "I cross," he says, "I hope it'll fall on the tops of the rishes." Well, that's plain to be seen, why the tops, you never seen rushes without the tops of them, there's a little bit of all the tops of them burnt to a brown colour, isn't that?
Oh, that's true, that's true.
Well, the second time he cursed, the boy said again, "I cross," he said, "I hope it'll fall on the tops of the haystacks, or the corn stacks."
Yes.
And on my word, you will see the tops of the stacks out in October or November, a little bit brown, a little bit at the top of them.
Yes.
And the third time he cursed, the boy said again that he crossed, that "I hope it'll fall," he says, "on the tops of the high mountains." And the tops of the high mountains there isn't a bit of heat growing on them, if you notice. I noticed that on that hill above myself. Right. They're gone a little brown, Well, they aren't right down lower with the green heat, they're gone a reddish brown.
So those are Patrick's curses, which thankfully were saved by some unknown young lad.
I love when you go through the stories in the archive, his associates or his assistants always change. So you go from, what was his name?
Benignus was one.
Down to Dillon.
Dillon.
yeah.
Dillon. And one of them was buried, or no, is it that near Croagh Patrick there's a cairn, there's a burial mound called Mionnan, which is taken to mean Muv Yunnan, as in my Ben and my Benignus. It's a bit of a kind of tenuous link, but that was Benignus was buried on that spot. But he has these kind of associates that travel around with him. Whatever.
But there's so much in place name lore across Ireland. Even if you were to go into duhis.ie, our digital platform, and check, you've got all of St. Patrick's holy wells. You've got all of these place names with down Patrick.
Yeah,
you name
it's
it.
kind of impossible to cover the amount of material that is associated with him. But the national spread of him is remarkable. It really is, because you have so many other saints who have kind of garnered another type of devotion really from many people in Ireland for a long time, but they don't have the same national spread really as St. Patrick that been seen to visit the whole country. I'm from County Wicklow, south of Dublin, on the eastern side of Ireland, whatever. And the Irish name, well, the English, it's one of those funny kind of names where the English name and the Irish name are from two separate sources. Wicklow is from Vikingslow, Viking field, which shows kind of Viking invasion of that place. But the Irish word is Kilvanton, which you often absorb these place names growing up and don't think about them. Absolutely. And realise it means Church of the Toothless One, which is a bizarre kind of name. But the story and the reasoning behind this narrative relates directly to St. Patrick, where when he arrives from Britain and returns to Ireland, he comes ashore apparently, and according to this legend, in County Wicklow, in the eastern kind of portion of the country, and he's not well greeted by the townspeople there, by the locals, who hurl rocks and abuse at him. And all of them miss Patrick miraculously, because nothing can touch him, and they all kind of miss him, whatever. But his unlucky sidekick in this case gets smashed in the face by one of these rocks, and all his teeth are knocked out. And this individual becomes nicknamed Montach, which means like toothless person, gummy face, whatever. And so Montach travels around and eventually comes back to the place in Wicklow, and he establishes a church there, Kilvanton, and that's how it then garners the name of the county to this day, is based on this figure associated with St. Patrick. But these stories of him travelling around the country are kind of particularly common. And apart from an individual, he also often associated with, he'd have an animal, a holy kind of, or a kind of supernatural creature, often a goat or a donkey or something. And sometimes, on account of the fact that St. Patrick was seen at times to bless certain septs and tribes and curse others, it seems to have carried over into folk tradition that he's used as a figure So say that I, in my parish, would slag you and yours by saying, oh, St. Patrick never visited your people because the people are too stupid and the place is awfully bleak and not worth visiting, or something like that. They'd use this kind
Very
of...
personal, Johnny.
It was a bit, was it? That they'd use this kind of idea of the saint to and reinforce these parochial rivalries, which are hilarious, some of them. Or they'd say that, oh, your people stole his goat and ate it, but our people didn't do that, or whatever. I've two quick examples to show from that. And this guy is hilarious. He's talking about, he's in County Cork, in the southwestern portion of the country, and he's talking about the Kerry people, who are also kind of in this bordering area, refusing to accept responsibility for eating the goat or something like that. And he's not really joking about it. This is recorded by Duhallow Hogan, and this is Donal O'Sheachan, recorded in 1975. So
St. Patrick, of course, blessed Duhallow, from just over the border from somewhere around the Bucaras, blessed the whole of Duhallow. And there is a story in connection with this, that St. Patrick's donkey was stolen in Duhallow. I don't know how true that's, but if it is true, it's also probably true that it was a Kerryman was responsible, because the border is very near there at that point. It's kind of local folklore, but any Duhallow, there's very few Duhallow men will admit to it anyway, and that's among a few of the older people whose credibility I won't dare to question. And this, as a matter of fact, I'm quite prepared to accept it, that it was a Kerryman was responsible for it, not a Duhallow man. Duhallow men wouldn't do anything like that.
it's great, isn't it? Duhallow man wouldn't do it like that. Hilarious.
It was a Kerry man. He's very
He's
stringent,
very
isn't he?
serious, yeah. Now, that's the southwestern portion of this island. Travel up to Skerries, to the easterly kind of quarter in North County Dublin. And the same narrative being used about the same, used to describe the same thing, or our people would never do that. But the people in this place, they did it, and they never admit to it, or whatever. This is Rose O'Connor, and she was recorded in 1980 as part of the Urban Folklore Project, and she's describing the same motif where people in a neighbouring parish steal St. Patrick's goat and eat him, basically.
Tell us about the St. Patrick's goat. Do you remember that?
Yes, St. Patrick came on to dry land.
Yeah.
And the Skerries people seized this, they didn't want him on there. You see, they were all non-sectarian, you know what I mean? Skerries was non-sectarian at that time. And he came on to the Skerries onto dry land. For where Red Island is do you know where Red Island is?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's where he landed. He came in on dry land onto Red Island for to preach to the people and try and convert the Skerries people. And he was preaching to them, and that night they stole his goat and ate him, killed him and ate him. Had a big bonfire and the mill hill in Skerries.
I see.
And they ate his goat, and that's how they got their name, Skerry goats.
Well, the Skerries people themselves don't tell that story about themselves, do
No,
they?
they don't. No, not Skerries.
They'd be shy about telling it.
They're very sorry. And Skerries is, from that date, Skerries always linked in, they're all linked in into one another through marriage.
I see. Is that so?
Oh yeah, Skerries.
It's a conspiracy.
Just defamation courts are calling out.
The Skerries goats. The Skerries people don't tell them. It's brilliant. I love those kind of local rivalries. But they're so from two opposite kind of portions of the country, same motif being used for the same purposes, really, to reinforce local boundaries and say no, not us, them,
But again, it's just that tying back to the likes of Doohan and Murrahu. It's all about the local, isn't it? And kind of claiming him for yourselves and keep showing yourselves in the best light. Because it kind of just reminds me of this. It's a little hilarious little song from Limerick that I found on duhus.ie, and it's about St. Patrick's I suppose genealogy, and it says, St. Patrick was a gentleman, he came from decent people. He built a church in Dublin town and on it put a steeple. His father was a Gallagher, his mother was O'Brady. His aunt was Anne O'Shaughnessy, first cousin to O'Grady. And it's just, it just brings it home to me that in many of the tales that we have here in the archive, it's about Patrick as a local as much as a national. Yeah,
it is true. And the other thing that you find often in versions of apocryphal lore regarding the Holy Family and the saints as they traipse around Ireland, it'll be just that. It'll be, as Christ and his mother were travelling through Kerry one day, or they were walking through Offaly, or it's filling in the gaps that dogmatic kind of scripture doesn't offer, and say Christ and his mother will meet some pagan deity or something like that, and it's that even it's as though these gods are all exist, they're all manifest in the same kind of cosmos, whatever. It's not that those ones aren't real and these ones are. They all overlap and exist together in this scenario. But yeah, he's a figure who's kind of in a way, he's humanized. He's also kind of obviously a highly supernatural figure or a superhero. He's battling druids in certain places and dashing their brains out and converting
monsters and
chieftains.
reptiles.
Yeah, and then at the same time, he's kind of, it's Mrs. O'Grady's son and this sort of thing. It's one of the other kind of common legends that was told about him was that he was in the house, or he was in an ale house in a tavern, which was run by a particularly greedy woman in this particular place, and she was very stingy with the measures that she was pouring. And what did Patrick say to her? He said that she'd have to change her ways. Basically, took her down to the basement where his huge kind of demon was lurking, and it was kind of fat and delighted with itself, and it was growing fat on her selfishness, basically. And so she was terrified and asked him to please banish it, and he said that he couldn't, that she'd have to mend her ways. So off he goes, travelling around the country, and he comes back to her a while later, and when he comes in, he notices that she's filling these glasses to overflowing. And when he goes and approaches her and talks to her, and they go back down to the basement, and this demon has become a kind of shriveled little kind of wretch, and it is wasted away on account of her generosity, basically. And having seen it, it's banished, it disappears, and kind of in a flame at the roof or whatever. But from that day onward, this is the reason we were told that Lenten observances for the Irish could be broken on St. Patrick's Day, and people would traditionally engage in drinking and drowning the shamrock, so-called, putting the shamrock in your whatever you're drinking. And that has become a commonplace kind of theme today, where it's a day of revelry and excess and drinking and so on in many places.
It is around the world, especially amongst the Irish diaspora.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, apparently it's the most celebrated, what was it, internationally or something that's linked to a national country or whatever, but it's celebrated in the most countries more than any other festival like it.
I believe that, especially when they turn rivers green and pints green and
yes, no doubt.
You name it.
Yeah. But perhaps we should wrap it up.
I think
at
that's
that
a
stage.
nice point.
And to suppose to close, instead of the well, it is a treat from the archive, but it's, again, since this edition has been dedicated to Finbar Boyle, on the topic of drowning the shamrock and so on, I have a fantastic song of his which will play now. This was recorded in 1984 at Fork Hill at a singing festival, and this is about the raid on Oney's bar one night by the guards, basically. This is a song that Finbar's singing, but he also wrote it and composed it, and it shows just fantastic, his wit. But yeah, we'll leave you with this, with Finbar Boyle and the raid on Oney's bar, and may he rest in peace. And sure, well, have a fine St. Patrick's Day. And
drown the shamrock with care,
indeed,
and
in good company.
In very good company, and raise a toast to Patrick and Palladius.
Indeed.
And all who came before us.
Indeed. Right, here's to us. Slán.
Slán Harja.
I sing it just on condition that the door is kept shut and that one of the participants is kept out while I'm singing it. One evening I laid down to crows 3 days straight to a bar that is famous for doing a late trade in spirits and beer and in red lemonade among company that's kindly and jovial. The man from Kinally put me at me ease, and he sat me down cosy before a great blaze, and he filled me a pint and a half and that pleased, and another wee drop came from Oney. For an hour and a half I drank liquor so rare you would think it was brewed by the gods, I declare, out of nectar and honey and lotuses fair. Sure, it only came over the border. And at 11:30 we sadly prepared to return to our lodgings back where we were reared. We packed up our bags, we were filled with dull cares, and then only put in a big order. And the tipplers relaxed and returned to their drinks, rejoicing that now they need not feel the pinch. Peter Short finished off the last eighth of an inch. He was sucking since 7:20. And the music began in an old-fashioned style. You would travel to hear it for many a mile. I was drinking and laughing away all the while. Sure, I thought I was dead and in heaven. There was lads there from Newry, the Rock and the Hack, some that came from Belfast and that never went back, and more lived convenient to Carroll the Black, and every man Jack's willing porter. There was some came from Hill Street and more from the Quay, some cross Midland patriots turning away. In a scheme done a mine, they were all in array, but each man kept himself in good order. Now a dirty big guard that was out in the street, on passing the door, heard the music so sweet. And he kicked up his heels and he bet a retreat to summon up two of his cronies. They quickly returned to the scene of the crime, and they called on the company to fight or resign. Let them in, cried Pat Murphy, we'll only be fined on the night that the guards raided Onies. Says the sergeant on entering, what's this I see? And why is so many all out on the spree? Can it be that the country at long last is free? Our conduct it is most nefarious. Sure, sergeant, it's not free, then no needed say. If you wish to drink beer like the rest, you must pay. We'll stay here if we elect till the clear light of day. Sure you know in Dundalk we're gregarious. And the guards that went round and they took all our names, and they struggled to spell with their feeble wee brains. And of some names in Irish they made a great hymns, and more they abandoned forever. To the roof the Mulhollands they quickly did climb, to the gators from afar at the scene of the crime. And to watch the old guards making good overtime when they gather the lads all together. May the divilly hoist them high up on a ramp, the sergeant, the guard, and the lad with the lamp. The dirty men, miserable poxy low tramps from the bogs that was dragged up so lowly. May they always see suffering, sorrow and pain. May their boots never fit, may their belts never strain. If they interrupt such a grand evening again as the night that the first raided Oni. That their motors may stand, that their noses may run, that their necks once so red may turn green in the sun, that their teeth may turn black and fall out one by one, that starvation may make them grow bony, that their ashes may fester and drop to their heels, that their last day and minutes be tempered with squeals, that they may dance forever the jigs and the reels with the devil for raiding poor Oni.